Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. Always a pleasure to be together, to learn together. Drisha is through Folzman right now. Lots of classes. Today's class is Death, Love, and Life in the Thought of Franz Rosenzweig with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. Just a few words about how we run the classes. I'll be sending everyone an invitation to become. Oh, it looks like everyone here is already a panelist. So all good with that. Feel free to unmute when you would like to make comments or ask questions. Just make sure that you keep yourself muted when you're not actively speaking. I'll help with that too. And you can also engage, make comments and ask questions on the chat here on Zoom or as a comment if you're watching us live on Facebook. Welcome to our Facebook viewers as well. Just a few words about Franz Rosenzweig that the class is. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Rabbi Truboff, feel free to jump in.
Rosenzweig.
Okay, Rosenzweig. So the Israeli pronunciation. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Franz Rosenzweig has long been considered one of the most innovative Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. Though known for its obscurity, his thought offers profound insight into what it means to be religious in the modern age by showing how theological concepts do not only exist in heaven, but must be made real in our lives. This course will explore core themes in the writings, such as revelation and redemption, and their continued relevance to Jewish life today. With me, I have Rabbi Zachary Truboff. He's the author of Torah Goes Forth from Zion, Essays on the Thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. And he's also the director of rabbinic education for the International Bet Din, where he teaches about the halachic approaches used by the Bet Din to free agunot. Before making Aliyah, he served for nearly a decade as the rabbi of Cedar Sinai Synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio. Rabbi Truboff is originally from Sharon, Massachusetts, and now lives in Jerusalem with his wife Jen and their 4 children. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you for the introduction. As was mentioned, I'm coming to you from Yerushalayim. And not under the most easiest of circumstances, as you're probably all aware here. In a certain sense, I'm very glad to be teaching Franz Rosenzweig right now, because, as the title of the course indicates, his writings attempt to grapple with the big questions, right? The big issues in life that we're often circling around, but rarely are able to go at directly. Issues like death, love, and life, which are issues that all human beings have to deal with. And his writings are, originate from a perspective that tries to grasp things in the broadest possible lens. And that is a lens that is very much oftentimes political, historical, and theological. War is something that Rosenzweig experienced firsthand, as we'll see in a little bit. And it's not so much that war in its uniqueness shapes Rosenzweig's thought, but Rosenzweig is one of those rare thinkers who recognizes that none of the difficult parts of life can be excluded from our religious thinking, right? I just sort of note the obvious here, right? If you're studying Jewish texts, right, they often focus on more abstract concepts or ideas, and there's often a certain set of themes that you keep coming back to. And as I said before, it was written up in the description when I was thinking about the class. But when we think about Jewish thought, when we think about Jewish texts, there's very much a sense that they exist up in heaven, right? They exist in this ideal form. But what Rosenzweig is trying to do more than anything is grapple with life here on earth in all of its messiness, in all the aspects of life that don't fit into the religious vision or the secular vision that we have for the world, but we still have to deal with, right? War has been a continued part of human existence. And therefore, if you're going to say anything about human beings, you got to be able to grasp with the reality of war and try to say something about it. So I'll just note that from the get-go. Just as a side note, There haven't been too many rockets directed at Jerusalem, like every other day. But if it happens that there is a rocket warning, I will have to jump off. I'll let you know. And if there's more than like 20 minutes left in the class, I'll try to be able to get back on. Why Franz Rosenzweig? As was also mentioned, Rosenzweig's thought is known for its obscurity. If you open up Rosenzweig's, magnum opus, the Star of Redemption, wherever you open up into it, right, you're gonna find things that don't seem to quite make sense, right? You'll read paragraphs and you'll be like, well, there's something here, but I don't really get it. Now, I think most people, when they read Rosenzweig, they recognize that there is a depth there, right? They recognize that there's like a truth there, that he's saying something true, he's saying something real. But I think for a lot of us, it's not always so clear to us exactly what that is. And one of my goals in this class is to get us a little bit more familiar with Rosenzweig's style, Rosenzweig's approach, and why I think his writings have so much to offer us. So let me, before we are going to dive into some of the writings, I want to just get a little bit more biographical background on Rosenzweig, because he is one of these thinkers with whom the biography and the philosophy/theology are fundamentally intertwined. Rosenzweig actually writes this in his journals. He notes that philosophy is always in some ways a reflection of biography, that how we look at the world is always going to in some way be a reflection of our own experiences of it. And we can't fundamentally ever separate those two things. So in that sense, I think it's important to look at his biography. And it's true, I think, for all of us, right? The big questions that animate our lives are the questions that emerge from our real everyday life experiences. They don't emerge, not the questions that animate us, that drive us, right, from just pure theoretical abstractions. So to sort of give you a little bit of background on Rosenzweig, part of what makes Rosenzweig so important, I think, for us as modern Jews, and this is a fact you may already be familiar with, is that Rosenzweig himself does not grow up in what we would call a traditionally Jewish home. He grows up in what we would call a reform or mostly assimilated home in Germany. He's born in 1886 in Kassel, which is a city in Germany. And at the time, German Jewry is basically split between, again, what we would call reform or liberal Judaism, which is, again, heavily assimilated, right? These are Jews who are basically, I'd say 3-day-a-year Jews, but it's really more like 2-day-a-year Jews. What's striking for people of Rosenzweig's background, and this is, again, true of figures like Herzl's in Vienna, but nonetheless, right, many of the sort of classic European Jewish thinkers that were familiar with Zionists at the turn of the 20th century are people that grew up in primarily assimilated homes. And what was striking about them is that they didn't know a whole lot about Judaism, about textual Judaism, about a living practice of Judaism, but they all had this profound sense of Jewish identity. They felt they were Jews in their kishkas in ways that I would say even many religious Jews today don't necessarily quite feel, right? They knew they were a Jew, right, in the deepest recesses of their soul, even if they didn't exactly know what that means, even if they never thought that there was anything religious there. There was still something real there, something undeniable. So it's an unusual mix to really not necessarily know a ton about Judaism, but feel in the deepest recesses of your kishkas that you are Jewish. Now, Rosenzweig, it's often played up the fact that he grew up more assimilated, and he did, but he was somebody who was from his youth had a deep interest in religious and theological and spiritual questions. Right? He is somebody, again, already as a child, thinking about God, thinking about questions about God and religious life. And these are things that are animating him from the time that he's young. But again, he grows up in an upper middle class family, pretty wealthy. His father is like an industrialist. He owns a factory. They're big machers in Kassel, in the Kassel Jewish community. But again, Rosenzweig does not have much of any kind of true Jewish depth or interiority. He goes off to college, like many Jews even do today. And that really becomes an opportunity for him to engage, I would say, even further with German society. Just sort of like start asking questions that many Jews today do when they reach college or university, is like, who do I want to be? What kind of Jew do I want to be? Do I even want to be a Jew? There's now all these other options and possibilities. right? Rosenzweig pursues a variety of different majors at first. He's in medicine, then he switches to philosophy. Then he focuses on what we would say German idealism, and particularly the great German philosopher Hegel and Hegel's philosophy of right, Hegel's conception of the state. Rosenzweig completely immerses himself in philosophy. And again, not just philosophy, but German idealism. People may not be familiar with what German idealism is. It's a particular school of German philosophy. It begins with Immanuel Kant, continues with, these are names you may not have heard before, but I'll just say them, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. And what's so fascinating about German idealism, which again, many people don't really realize, is that it is in many ways the foundation of all modern philosophy that follows, particularly continental philosophy. And what makes German idealism so special is that it tries to think through the broadest possible lens. It does not just focus on narrow questions. It tries to create systems that can encompass everything. And what's so powerful about that is that German idealism tries to think, all of those thinkers I mentioned, they try to think the secular and the religious together, because they know if you want to try to grasp the full range of the human experience, you have to look at both religion and secular. You cannot look at one without the other, and you have to realize that they are both together part of a broader picture. So that's the sort of orientation that Rosenzweig is coming from, trying to grasp everything, and doing it rather brilliantly. The insights of German idealism, to me at least, and they still get me excited even a couple hundred years later, are profound, deep, and they touch upon everything, and they think through everything. There's very few philosophical questions today that haven't been touched upon in depth by a lot of the core thinkers of German idealism. That's the sort of intellectual orientation that he has, and it really provides the tools that Rosenzweig is going to bring to thinking about the questions that really are going to bother him as he gets older. But the most important event in Rosenzweig's life, when he is in his young adulthood, is that after he completes his doctorate, he has a conversation with another German Jew, or to be more correct, a German who is no longer Jew, and converted to Christianity, Eugene Rosenstock. And through this conversation, Rosenzweig's whole world basically changes forever, right? I don't know if you remember when you were in college, but sometimes when you're in your college, you're up late at night talking with all sorts of interesting people, and you suddenly have to confront truths and ideas that you've never really experienced before. Or you have that friend, that acquaintance that starts pushing you on one of your core beliefs and keeps pushing and starts to make you feel uncomfortable. And you start to realize that maybe that core belief that's always kind of shaped your world, maybe you don't really know if it's true. Maybe you don't have great grounding for that belief that maybe up until then had actually helped shape your entire life. That was the kind of conversation that Rosenzweig had with Rosenstock, because what Rosenstock did is he pushed Rosenzweig to ask like a very simple question in a sense, but a very profound one, which is like, why are you still Jewish, right? For Rosenzweig, though he had a deep attachment to Judaism, right, it was a Judaism that was primarily empty. And Rosenzweig was somebody who believed that religion, theology, God, had an extraordinarily important place in human existence. And what Rosenstock forced Rosenzweig to confront was that if you think religion is so important, why are you still a Jew, right? Because it would make a heck of a lot more sense for you to be a Christian, right? Christianity was the animating force in European culture, particularly certainly in Germany, right? And if you want to like be somebody who can be in the world, whose theology can fully immerse you within the world and imagine how the world can be transformed, right? Then you should be a Christian. And that conversation really pulled the rug out from under Rosenzweig. It really shattered his world to a certain extent when he was pushed so hard on that. And for the next few months, he seriously considered converting to Christianity. Before he goes through with the conversion, right? The conversion, he says, was going to take place after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Before he goes through with the conversion, he says he wants to have one more Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur as a Jew, right? Because just as the original Christians were Jews who then converted to Christianity, he wants to convert to Christianity as a Jew and not as a pagan. I mean, he wants to give Judaism that full respect it deserves. Now, it's not, there's a famous story that, Rosenzweig has some experience on Yom Kippur that changes everything for him. That is almost definitely not true, right? In his letters, he's already talking about in the stage between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that he's thinking differently about his Judaism, that he wants to stay a Jew. But there's this apocryphal story that was popularized by one of his students, by Nachum Glatzer, that implies Yom Kippur is when everything changed. But regardless, Rosenzweig comes to the conclusion that he wants to remain a Jew and he doesn't want to convert. But the question is, if you're going to remain a Jew, what exactly does that mean for him, for all of us at this point in time? And that is what sets him off for the rest of his life. He begins studying more Jewish texts with the German philosopher Hermann Cohen, and then he eventually goes to serve in World War I, originally in the Red Cross, and then I think he gets brought out of the Red Cross to maybe like a German unit. He spends 3 years in the war, in World War I, much of it at the front. And again, this World War I is the most brutal war that human beings really have ever known. Loss of life is unimaginable, brutal, vicious loss of life. Rosenzweig experiences it. And the big change in his life, he says, comes before this, when he almost decides to convert, but decides to stay a Jew. But it's clear the war also has an impact on his thoughts. And by the end of the war, he starts writing on postcards home to his parents what will become essentially his great philosophical work, The Star of Redemption, which he publishes a couple of years later. He then goes on to become appointed the head of the Lehrhaus in Frankfurt. And this is a big deal because the Lehrhaus is part of Rosenzweig's vision of a Beit Midrash, a place where Jews can study together, that will basically be a place where anybody can come and learn, right? It's not going to be a traditional Beit Midrash or yeshiva in the Orthodox sense. This is going to be a place where any Jew can come and learn, even if they don't know nothing, if they don't know anything at all, right? This is a place where they can find a way to begin to engage the Torah in a serious fashion, which in a certain sense today is not so revolutionary, right? There are many Jewish institutions dedicated to that sort of open, inclusive vision of text study, Jewish text study. But in 1920, there wasn't anything really quite like it. And Rosenzweig's vision of it was profound, and the teachers that he gathered together to be part of it was some of the greatest thinkers and teachers and intellectuals of Jewish history. So you have Gershom Shalom, who lectures a bit there, Martin Buber, who lectures there, Shai Agnon lectures there, Bertha Pappenheim lectures there. I mean, they're very, very famous and important people. In 1922, Rosenzweig is diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and he's already had some health issues around it, but the disease then progresses for the next 7 years. Within a couple of years, he's already in paralysis, I think by 1924 or 25. And at that point, when he's basically paralyzed, he is only able to communicate to other people through a machine that was basically made to sort of track his eye movements. He can still move his eye a bit, and his wife, Edith, assists him by sort of seeing where his eye tracks on a sort of like a page that identifies certain letters. And then by putting those letters together to make words, that is how Rosenzweig communicates with the outside world. And it's a profound thing. And we'll see this also a little bit more today. Like, what does it mean to be in that position, in that condition, when it appears that everything has been taken away from you as a human being, right? Like at that point, what do you have left? And again, there's a reason why a lot of people with ALS consider suicide, because it would seem that ALS, when you're finally locked in and you cannot communicate at all, is in some ways like a fate worse than death. But for every moment of his disease, Rosenzweig fights like a Jew is supposed to do, to be in this world and to be part of this world in the fullest possible sense. So that's the background, some of the biographical background. There's much more to say here, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview about Rosenzweig. And again, just to keep sort of easing ourselves into it here, I want to give you a little bit about another person's account of Rosenzweig, somebody whose opinion I think we should respect, because he also happens to be one of the greatest Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century, and that's Gershom Shalom. Right, Gershom Shalom, famous scholar of Jewish mysticism at Hebrew U for many, many years, originally from Germany, proud Zionist, makes Aliyah as part of his Zionism. Before he leaves for Israel, he has an encounter with Rosenzweig. They have mutual friends. All right. Again, one of the strange things about early 20th century, the Weimar Republic, and even before Weimar, but early 20th century Germany, all the famous Jewish thinkers, they all were within like 1 or 2 degrees removed of each other. So they all like either know each other or they know people in common. And Shalom and Rosenzweig had a mutual friend who connects the two, Rudy Hallow. And Shalom goes to visit Rosenzweig. And here's how he describes meeting Rosenzweig. He says, and again, Shalom already from a relatively young age too. I think, if I remember correctly, Shalom's maybe a little younger than Rosenzweig, but Shalom is also pretty brilliant from a young age, and somebody who's going to go on and shape, Jewish thought in the 20th century. So what he says in his description of Rosenzweig is as follows. He says, I'd been in Frankfurt for 3 days the previous year and had seen Rosenzweig there several times. Rudy Hallow, a young man who, like Rosenzweig, was from Kassel and had for some time been deeply influenced by him, had been my fellow students in Munich. Hallow and Rosenzweig are close. They're family friends. They grew up together. And Hallow gets to know Shalom as a student in Munich. Right, and Hallow makes the connection between the two. From Hallow, I learned much about Rosenzweig, his development in turning to Judaism. In early 1920, Hallow brought me a copy of Rosenzweig's recently published main work, The Star of Redemption, undoubtedly one of the central creations of Jewish religious thought in this century. Thus, I started corresponding with Rosenzweig, who had in the meantime heard about me from various sources. But part of the reason they're connecting is they're both brilliant German Jews who want in some way to connect with the tradition. And don't exactly know how. They don't have like a pathway, right, that can bring them to it, so they kind of have to make their own. He continues, he says, at that time, Rosenzweig still had his health and had started to study the Talmud with the famous Rabbi Dr. Nobel, Nehemiah Nobel in Frankfurt, who was one of the rabbi of one of the Orthodox synagogues there. Nobel was a fascinating figure in his own right. He has a doctorate in Schopenhauer that he wrote under Hermann Cohen. And he was a very important leader and a Zionist, big Zionist in Germany. Very much, I would say, like a modern Orthodox rabbi in the best sense of the word. And Rosenzweig was close to him for a couple of years before Nobel passed away and learned Talmud, learned Gemara with him. And here's the key line from Shalom. Every encounter with Rosenzweig furnished evidence that he was a man of genius. I regard the abolition of this category, which is popular today, as altogether foolish, and the reasons adduced for it as valueless. Right. So it's the last part of this that I'm most interested in that what Shalom is making clear is that in these encounters with Rosenzweig, right, that Rosenzweig was somebody whose genius was obvious. And again, you could call Shalom a genius, clearly, but Shalom is noting that there is something about Rosenzweig's brilliance that stands apart. All right. And what's significant for Shalom that he notes is that, genius as a concept is something that we both romanticize and also try to explain away, right? So when I say we romanticize it, right, because there's a certain sensibility that it's like the great genius who shows up and can think things and see things that nobody else can see, right? On the other hand, we sort of try to explain it away, right? We do that by trying to argue, right, that there is no such thing as like a truly new idea, right? That all ideas are built on, right, sort of the ideas that came before them, right? And that when we think something is really new, no, when you look clearly, you see it has its antecedents, right? There's this thinker, there's this thinker, there's this thinker. Really, somebody is just putting these pieces together. It looks like it's new, but it's really not new, right? That's the sort of general trend that we have. Shalom is very bothered by the idea that genius as a category is something that we would dismiss. And it's not just because, like, Shalom believes in brilliance. The reason that Shalom thinks genius is a category we shouldn't just erase, because genius reflects, right, the notion that there can be something new, right, that there can be a break between what came before and what is going to be, right? Because part of the idea of genius is that they change the way that we look at things, right? That's in some ways the most important part of genius. It's not that they can like calculate things and think things that are just like too much, right? Like for the rest of us normal people, right? The true power of genius is that they change the way we think, right? The other classic German Jewish example of this at this time is who, right? Not necessarily in philosophy or in Jewish studies, right? But Albert Einstein, right? Albert Einstein, through his unique genius, fundamentally changed the way that we look at everything. And again, was it that Einstein's work wasn't based on people who came before it? Of course it was in physics, right? He wasn't the only one grappling with these things. But it is the power of genius to change the way we look at everything. And the reason that, again, is so significant is something that Jacques Derrida picks up on. Jacques Derrida writes a long essay on a letter that Shalom actually writes to Rosenzweig, a very interesting letter that we're not going to look at today, But in that essay, he cites from this piece from Shalom, and he notes Shalom's comment here that in the modern world, we don't like the idea of genius too much, right? We don't like the idea there can actually be a break, that there can actually be something new, that there actually can be something singular, something that is unlike anything else, right? So here's what Derrida says. He says, there would be much to say about this remark made in passing by Shalom, that we don't like genius today, right? And what Derrida notes is that this comment is a critique of a kind of secularizing rationalization that flattens, levels, evens out with the language, the resistance of any singularity or any exception, right? We want to put things within certain frameworks and say they are fully explicable, right? They are fully explainable, right? There's nothing that, again, can't be explained, right? That's science's, great hubris, right? Everything can be explained. Everything has a cause. Everything can fit into a paradigm, right? Everything follows the rules, right? But what Derrida is noting, which I'm already pointed out, is that there are things in this world that don't always do that, right? There are things in this world that seem to stand apart from the way that everybody thinks about things. And the challenge is that we have to learn to make a space for those things that are singular, because as Derrida goes on to say, right, that when we reject singularity, when we reject things that are the exception, he says a certain geniality, which could be shown to be not unrelated to sacredness, right? If you want to have any conception of holiness, right, of Kedusha in this world, then you have to make a space for things that don't quite fit in, for things that are singular, for things that are exceptional, right? People, right, on a certain level, people like Rosenzweig. Now, what's important to keep in mind for Rosenzweig is that when we think about the idea of singularity or exception, Rosenzweig in his very essence reflects that. But one of the things that we're going to see both today and we're going to focus on next week as well is that the singularity that Rosenzweig most asks us to be attuned to is the singularity of human existence, the singularity of every human being, right? That there is something about human beings, each human being, that makes human beings exceptional and singular, right? That makes you unlike anybody else, right? That no matter what box we try to put you in to describe you, capture you, there is always going to be parts of you that exceeds it. And the parts of you that exceed that box that the world tries to put you into may be the things that make you in the image of God, right? That make you and every other person essentially holy. But the challenge is we have to learn to make a space for those things that are exceptional, for those things that are singular. And we live in a world right now where, again, everything needs to be kind of flattened. Everything needs to be put into sort of clear ways of explaining things, right? If we're going to be sort of extra critical for a moment, right? We live in a capitalist society where everything has a price, right? There isn't, I mean, that's the challenge of the world we live in, right? Everything has a price. And if everything has a price, everything has a clear value, delineated value measure, right? Then nothing can truly be singular. Nothing can truly be exceptional, right? Because if we want to figure out what it really is, we just have to find out how much it costs, right? And the challenge that Derrida, Rosenzweig, Shalom are all getting at is if you want to have any religious sensibility at all, or you have to realize there are things that are beyond a price, that are priceless, right? That are singular, that are exceptional, that captivate us to the extent that we never can quite let them go. Because I'll tell you right now, the things that matter most to us, the people that matter most to us, are the things and the people that we are actually able to recognize on some level as being singular, at some level as being exceptional. And what Rosenzweig understood, it is a profound achievement to be able to look at another human being and to see them as singular, right? To see them as exceptional, to see them as created in the image of God, right? There's a certain liberal Jewish language, which I don't always love, which emphasizes again, I mean, and you've heard it a lot the last couple of weeks as this war is taking place, as a lot of innocents are being killed, right? Every human being is created in the image of God. It's our challenge to see every human being is created in the image of God, because every human life is infinite, right? Every human life, is priceless, right? How can we tolerate the deaths of anyone, right? So that kind of thinking, again, those moral exhortations are important in a certain sense, but there's a profound problem with them, which is, in truth, we don't see people as singular. Right? We don't see people as exceptional, right? We see them as part of a broader system or scheme or game or politics that we're playing. And to be able to see a human being as singular, even just one person in this world, is a profound moral and spiritual achievement. And we'll try to pick up on that in the weeks to come to flesh that out a little bit more. So for Rosenzweig, another point I'll just mention here, we're not going to actually read this letter. Part of the reason I think I'm just appreciative of him is that he is somebody who, as I described, he has this moment in his life where everything changes for him and he seriously considers giving up being Jewish, converting to Christianity, right? He later goes on to describe that experience as a collapse for him, right? He has a moment where his world collapses and he has to find a way to keep going. He has to find a way to pick up the pieces, so to speak, or to look through the broken pieces of his world and find that which can still have value for him. I find that extremely profound because I think we all know that each one of us in our lives has moments in which the world shatters for us. And the question I think that comes to us in those moments when the world shatters for us is not how do we hold on to how we viewed the world previously and try to hold it together with glue and rubber bands so that we can sort of keep going, pretending like everything is still okay. I think the thinkers that often impress me the most are the ones who recognize that when the collapse comes, right, that something new has to fundamentally emerge, right? That things can't just be like they always were. And for Rosenzweig, the fact that he is that kind of thinker means he's the kind of thinker who was open to the world changing him. And a lot of religious thinkers are not really open to that. They have a certain way of viewing the world and nothing can change that. Rosenzweig knows what it means when the world empties out of meaning, right? When it collapses, when it breaks, but that doesn't prevent us from still finding those things that are singular and exceptional, that can be, firm ground upon which we can stand, right? And which we can actually feel that our lives can be real. So with all of that as introduction, I know, again, some of this may sound abstract, some of this may sound philosophical. I'm going to do my best to keep trying to concretize it for us. And I'm going to do that by turning to the very first line of the Star of Redemption. This is a famous line. Sometimes when people open up the Star of Redemption, this is about as far as they get. We'll be bouncing back and forth between the Barbara Galli's translation and William Hallow's translation. There are two different translations of Star of Redemption. Galli's a little bit more recent. Hallow's is more accurate, but Galli sometimes I think is a little bit more poetic at times. And the opening line of the Star of Redemption is as follows. Rosenzweig writes, "From death, it is from the fear of death that all cognition of the all begins." Now, this line at face value just sounds, again, rather obscure and abstract, right? Like death, fear of death, cognition of the all, like what is going on here? So the key line in this, the key term that is in some ways like the hardest to grasp is this idea of the all, right? That we try to cognize, we try to think, we try to understand the all. And what drives us to try to understand the all is death, or the fear of death, or the awareness of death. So we have to understand, like, what is the all? Right? In German, it's das All. Like, well, what are we even talking about here? So part of this is because Rosenzweig is drawing on German idealism, and it's not a context that we typically are familiar with. So to give you a sort of like a slightly simpler version of what Rosenzweig is getting at here, I brought from an essay of Sigmund Freud's, called The Question of a I can't do the German well, Weltanschauung, right? Which is which means a worldview, right? Sigmund Freud has an essay here called The Question of a Worldview, right? That it was certainly popular in the 19th and 20th century that we would, and even today to a certain extent, is that we try to create a picture of the world that makes sense to us. We try to grasp this crazy, ridiculous world that we live in so that, like I keep saying, so we can find firm ground to stand upon, so that our lives can make sense, so there can be some sense of permanence, right? Some meaning and reason and purpose to why we are here as human beings, right? That we try to have a worldview, right? So here's how Freud describes it. And to a certain extent, I very much grasp this idea of what philosophy often tries to do. So Freud says, and I'm going to, instead of trying to read it as German, I'll just read it as worldview, right? Worldview is, I'm afraid, a specifically German concept, the translation of which into foreign languages might well raise difficulties. If I try to give you a definition of it, it is bound to seem clumsy to you. In my opinion, then, a worldview is an intellectual construction which solves all the problems of our existence uniformly on the basis of one of the overriding hypotheses, of one overriding hypothesis, which accordingly leaves no question unanswered, and in which everything that interests us find its place, right? So a worldview is a way to make sense of the world in which everything can sort of be fit together properly, right? It often emerges from some sort of overriding hypothesis, right? Some sort of core understanding of meaning, core principles, first principles that we use to sort of organize the world for us, right? And the beauty of a worldview is that when you encounter difficulty, when you encounter problems, right, like you always have an answer, right? Because the worldview's job is to be able to provide you with that, right? And that gives our world, our existence, a sense of stability, a sense of purpose, right? Like that even when it appears that it's coming undone, don't worry, we have an answer. Freud continues, he says, it will be easily be understood that the possession of a worldview of this kind is among the ideal wishes of human beings. I mean, who doesn't want to have a worldview that enables the world to make sense for you, right? Like I'm living in a moment right here in Israel and Jerusalem in which nothing makes sense a lot of the time. You watch the news, nothing makes sense in the world a lot of the time. Who doesn't want a worldview that puts everything in perspective, puts everything in its proper box, makes sure that when the news suddenly reports that a rocket has hit a hospital in Gaza, killing hundreds of Palestinians, your worldview tells you exactly how to make sense of that, right? That's a moment, that's an event that you now know exactly what to do with, right? That would be great. And for a lot of people, especially if you're on social media, right, they have a worldview that helps you make sense of that one way or the other, right? But in truth, I think as we all know, that no matter the worldview that you have, right, it regularly encounters events and moments that fundamentally challenge it. But nonetheless, as he says here, believing in it, one can feel secure in life, one can know what to strive for and how one can deal most expediently with one's emotions and interests, right? We want a worldview, we want a system, we want an ideology so that we can grasp the world, that it can feel safe and secure for us. And then Freud goes on here to describe that one of the frameworks we use to create a worldview, right, is philosophy. And he actually offers a little bit of a critique of philosophy here that's not that different from Rosenzweig, right? Because he notes that the aspiration of philosophy, the hubris of philosophy, is to be able to present a picture of the universe which is without gaps, right? Which is coherent, right? Which everything fits in its proper place, everything can be explained. Though Freud notes it's still one which is bound to collapse, which Freud understood and Rosenzweig understood, that whatever philosophical system, whatever ideological worldview we create, it is going to collapse because it is going to encounter the singularity. It's going to encounter the exception. It's going to encounter those things that it can't fully make sense of. It's going to encounter death, as Rosenzweig is about to tell us, right? And every worldview, to a certain extent, crumbles in the face of death, right? And as Freud goes on here, citing from Heinrich Heine, German poet, when it comes to philosophy, right? It's like with his nightcaps and tatters of his dressing gown, the philosopher patches up the gaps in the structure of the universe, right? That's what the philosopher tries to do. That's what the system tries to do, that the ideology tries to do, right? Everything can make sense, but only makes sense by covering over all the gaps, all the cracks, all the things that don't make sense, right? You have to exclude them if you're going to create a system that actually makes sense of the world. Now, Freud, and everything we just saw here, says a human being wants to have a worldview, wants to have an ideology because it makes their world safe and secure. What he doesn't mention, which is what Rosenzweig believes, is that the reason we need an ideology is because we need to have stable ground. Because once we recognize what death is and what death does, right, it feels like nothing around us is stable, right? That's in some ways the most scary part about being in a war, is that you don't feel that life is stable, right? You actually have to confront the reality that, like, when those sirens go off and I'm huddled with my kids, right, like that things could come to an end. And what you want more and most in those moments is the certainty of faith and that kind of thing, which gives your life a sense of permanence, a sense of infinity, a sense of eternity, no matter what. And that's what Rosenzweig knows, is that once we're aware that death is a possibility, we are going to try to grasp hold of anything that feels like it can give us safety and security. And human beings are profound in their ability to construct systems of meaning, to give us some sense of certainty, some sense of permanence in the face of death. But as Rosenzweig is about to describe, right, even the most powerful ideological worldview cannot help you when the sirens are going off and the rockets are falling, right? Like that's literally the example we're going to see in a moment that Rosenzweig uses. It's not something that people often realize at the beginning of the Star of Redemption, but Rosenzweig spent time on the front, a lot of time on the front, and he knows what it's like when the rockets are falling. And he knows what it's like when the bullets are whizzing by you. And in those moments, right, any kind of system, any kind of ideology will ultimately fail you. It doesn't fail you on social media. You're at a distance from death at that point. But when you're in Gaza, if you're on the border of Gaza, you're in the north, right? Like you're going to experience it, and all that comes with it. So that takes us to Rosenzweig continues here in the Star of Redemption. And this opening of the Star of Redemption is very much a critique of philosophy, of ideology, ideological worldviews that attempt to basically exclude the possibility of death, right? That if death is something that is out there, it is only temporary, right? Or it's necessary, or don't worry, right? We're still going to provide you something solid that you can hold on to, even if, your body perishes. So let me explain a little bit what he means by that. He says here, philosophy has the audacity to cast off the fear of the earthly, to remove from death its poisonous sting, from Hades his pestilential breath. But philosophy refutes those earthly fears. It breaks free above the grave that opens up under our feet before each step. It abandons the body to the power of the abyss, but above it the free soul floats off into the wind. Right? So philosophy provides a system of meaning, ideas, principles that we feel are holy and real, that even if our body dies, like we know that we are part of something more. We know that perhaps even we're sacrificing ourselves for some ideal, for some idea that we think is ultimately, eternal. That's what philosophy, that's what ideological worldviews provide for us. But what Rosenzweig is going to note that when philosophy does that, it's ultimately giving us an illusion. When philosophy, and again, I'm using philosophy broadly here, we could talk about ideology or any of these kinds of terms. What it provides us is a sense that there is something beyond ourselves that we are a part of, that even when we go, don't worry, there's a part of you that continues. And the challenge with this approach, right, that we are part of something more, that even when we die, right, we continue on in some way, right? The problem with this approach is that it doesn't easily hold up to reality, right? So what Rosenzweig goes on to describe here, and again, this opening part is very much coming, you might say, from a secular mindset. It is critiquing philosophy's attempt to give us something real in this world. Rosenzweig continues, he says that the fear of death knows nothing of such a separation in body and soul, that it yells, I, and wants to hear nothing about a deflection of the fear onto a mere body metaphysical philosophy. So here's the point Rosenzweig is making here, is that even though philosophy, ideology tries to provide us something that is worthwhile to die for because it will continue on beyond us, the problem is when you confront your own death, you realize that maybe it's not quite worth it. Maybe there's a part of you that wants to live, right? There's a part of you that wants to be here now in this world, no matter what, right? There's a part of you that Rosenzweig says here screams, I. Not that I'm part of something else that's going to live on beyond me, but that I want to be here in the right here and the right now. And Rosenzweig goes on, and this is where it hits home for me very, very strongly right now. He says that man may crawl like a worm into the folds of the naked earth before the whizzing projectiles of blind, pitiless death, or that there he may feel as violently inevitable that which he never feels otherwise. His eye would be only an it if it were to die, right? When you confront the reality of your own death, right, you realize that there's a part of you that's just not going to go on beyond this, right? Or maybe not even just a part of you, right? There's the entirety of you that may not quite go on beyond this. And when you confront that, all the illusions of ideology, all the illusions of philosophy, they just kind of evaporate right before you, right? Because you realize they cannot offer you something real, because as human beings created in the image of God, we want to be, and we want to be alive, and we want to be in this world. As Rosenzweig says here at the end here, he says, for man does not at all want to escape from some chain. He wants to stay. He wants to live. Right, and this is extraordinarily important for Rosenzweig, right? That the encounter with death, more than anything, makes us realize that what we want as human beings is we want to live. Right now, the challenge is that so often our fear of death leads us to invest, again, ideology, structures, systems that give us an illusion that we can live forever. And in doing so, by buying into those illusions, what really happens is that we don't live at all. Right? Like, I'll just, again, the simple sort of trite example of this, right? The person who is so afraid of death, right, that they spend every minute in this world trying to make as much money as they can, right? Out of this some sort of misguided belief that if you have enough zeros in your bank account, it's like you live forever, right? Like, we all kind of do this, whether it's about money or other ideological structures. We all assume if we can do enough of the right thing, right, there's a part of us that's going to sort of live, forever. But in the quest to sort of buy into those structures and systems, right, as many dollars as we can earn, what often happens is rather than actually being in life, right, we are taken out of life, right? And if there's one thing the encounter with death is supposed to teach us, is that we want to live, and we want to live in this world with other people, right? We don't want to just sort of dive into some illusion and call that life. Now, for Rosenzweig, probably the most concrete example of all this, so again, so it doesn't just sound like a bunch of abstractions here, is that he lived through World War I. He lived through a time when nationalism was inspiring thousands and millions of people to basically kill themselves for the state, right? And this is something that's very important because, again, we still sort of see this playing out today around the world, right? That part of what fueled the horrors of World War I were young men thinking to themselves, right, if I die on behalf of the state, on behalf of the nation, it's okay because the state, the nation offers me a sense of eternity. Right, there's actually, I didn't bring it here, but there are some great quotes like this, particularly from Germans, who like basically say that. And this is to a certain extent is what animates, right, sort of every nationalistic enterprise on one level or another, right, is that you're willing to die for the nation, for the state, because you believe that, you know, as part of you, right, the state, you lives on in that state, you know, in that nation, right, for eternity. It's an idea that we as Jews sort of relate to. Though for Rosenzweig, thinking about this in terms of political terms is wrong for Jews, right? But on a certain level, we all kind of get that, right? We all want to be part of something more. We also want to see our deaths as potentially contributing to that which is, you know, greater than us. But Rosenzweig also understood the extent to which that could be an illusion. That in a world in which it often feels like God is absent, we need something to replace God, and we need something that is powerful. And in this world where God appears absent, that which is most powerful is the state, right? Like the nation, right? The political entity, right? Like that, to a large extent, is what God becomes for us, right? And if God is the only thing that can tell us to kill, then in a world in which states are God, which nations are God, right? Then when they say to kill, that's what we're supposed to do, right? When they say to die, that's what we are ultimately supposed to do, right? That nations, the state, right, is the closest that most secular people have to an experience of transcendence, right? And probably the best example of this is, what's, from a secular perspective, what is sort of the holiest physical location in modern states, right? So you might say, well, it's where the head of state is, or where the, sort of the legislation meets in a particular state. But in truth, the location in which most embodies sort of the holy ground of any modern secular state is the tomb of the unknown soldier. Right? The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was a phenomenon that began after World War I, in part to sort of acknowledge the fact that millions of young men had died, in foreign lands, thousands of miles from home, and this couldn't even necessarily be brought back to be buried there. Most of them are buried in foreign lands. But nations, to honor that sacrifice, what they did is they brought one back home, originally in Britain, I think was the first place, right? And they buried that anonymous soldier in a tomb as a symbol, right, for every soldier who had died for the nation, but more than just as a symbol for the soldiers who had died, right? The unknown soldier is a symbol for the nation itself, right? That's why tombs of the unknown soldier feel like they are hallowed ground. They feel like they are sacred ground, right? If you've ever been on them, they're built like almost like churches in a sense, right? In fact, in Westminster Abbey, where I think the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is in London, it's the only part of Westminster Abbey when they do a coronation for the king that remains uncovered. They put like rugs all over the ground, even over the other graves, but not the grave of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, right? Because there's something about that is sacred, no matter what. Now, the concept of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is in a certain sense like a secular sacredness. It's the way that we embody the state by recognizing that every person is really subsumed within the state, right? That each of us is part of the state, each of us is part of the nation. Even if we die, right, we live on in the state, we live on in the nation. But the challenge with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and I think this is very important from a Jewish perspective, is that the body in the grave has to be anonymous. In fact, when Britain actually brought their soldier back to bury them in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, it seems like they might have known who the soldier actually was, but there was an effort not to reveal the name. Because once there's a name, that body in that grave can't actually represent the nation, right? Because once you have a name, you have a specific person, right? You have an individuality, right? You might even have a singularity there. There's something there. There's a person there, right? It can't just be an empty symbol. right? And one of the striking things that happens with the tombs of the unknown soldier is that over time, especially with DNA testing, is that we can actually find out who's in there, right? And there's something very strange and weird about that, right? Because once you find out who's in there, once that person has a name, they can't be in there anymore, right? Because the unknown soldier's got to stand in for everybody, for the nation. They're subsumed within that greater totality. And this dilemma is one that Rosenzweig, again, understood, that states offer sort of an illusion of permanence, of eternity, that we should die for them. We should die for that cause. Right? A lot of people right now who are in my neighborhood or who are thinking that way. But in truth, what we ultimately discover is that no human creation, whether it's a state or a nation or anything like that, can be a place where we find true permanence, where we can find true, holiness. And I think what's so striking, I said, from a Jewish perspective, is that if you are making a grave for a Jew, it doesn't matter, who they are, what the context is. If you know them, if that person has a name, there has to be a stone there, and that stone has to have a name on it, right? Because every human being has a name, every Jew has a name, and therefore every Jew deserves a grave for them, not as an empty symbol for the nation, but for who they are. Because there's something about being human, something about the singularity of being a human being that cannot fit into any sort of greater totality, right? Any greater symbolic structure that tries to absorb it. That being human means being unlike anything else in this world. And that sense of singularity, of exceptionality, will always come back. And the question is, what are we ultimately going to try to do with that? So I won't read any more from the Star of Redemption, but this is the point that Rosenzweig emphasizes, that in the face of death, we learn that all those ideological worldviews we have fall apart, right? All those systems of meaning that we've tried to create begin to collapse. We learn that in the face of death, we don't want to die, that these illusions that we've had about where we're going to find permanence aren't quite real for us. And what we do want deeply is we want to live. We actually fight death, right? We want to live. We want to be here. We want to be in this world. And we realize that there's no idea, there's no state, there's no great concept that can just fit us into it, subsume us into it. So it's as if even though we die, we're still living on, right? There's an element about being human that doesn't fit in any box. And it's that part of us that makes us want to be here and be in this world. And for Rosenzweig, when we confront our own singularity, that we want to be here no matter what, right? There's something very, very profound about that. Now, the last point I'll make before I'll try to open up for a few questions here.
Rabbi Truboff. Oh, okay, perfect. You're seeing the chat, right?
Oh, I didn't see the chat. I'm sorry.
Okay, we can wait and ask the question when it's time for questions.
Yeah, let me finish this piece,
perfect.
And then we can, and I'll open up some, some questions here. So, what I want to conclude with is a letter from an associate of Rosenzweig, Hans Tribb. It's a letter that he doesn't write to Rosenzweig, he writes to Martin Buber. But he writes the letter about his experience visiting Rosenzweig during Rosenzweig's illness, the latter stages of Rosenzweig's illness, when he's essentially completely paralyzed, only able to communicate maybe by eye movements. And he describes to Buber how profound it was to visit Rosenzweig. Now you have to understand, there's a certain mythos around Rosenzweig, even during his illness, right? That he is an example of the struggle of the human spirit, on a cultural level. People are wow, Rosenzweig, somehow he's still going, he's still doing this, he's still fighting. So you have to sort of take some of this with a little grain of salt. But Tribb also is getting at the fundamental singularity that is Rosenzweig himself, that is ultimately all human beings. And here's what he says. He says, I recently read Rosenzweig's essay, The New Thinking. One derives an exceedingly compelling inspiration from him. I'm looking forward to reading The Star of Redemption soon. How is he doing? I hardly dare ask him. Buber and Rosenzweig were very close. I often think of Rosenzweig. The past summer was marked by my visit to him. When I was in his room, something touched me that I cannot name. Is it the human being that is stirred in his totality and immobilized at the same time? Meaning, when you confront Rosenzweig at this point, what Tripp is noting is you see somebody that on the one hand, totally paralyzed, totally seems like they can't be part of the world at all, can't even speak. Yet at the same time, there's something about Rosenzweig that fights to be in this world, that fights to communicate and connect with other human beings in this world. What Tripp goes on to say is what was for me the most meaningful moments of this year occurred in that room in his confrontation and his encounter with Rosenzweig. I must not interpret the significance, I can only indicate it. He doesn't want to explain it away. right? There's something sacred and singular and special about what he experiences with Rosenzweig. He says, that day is ever present to me. I can see Rosenzweig before me in the flesh, immured in his paralyzed body, the highest measure of disability for a person, still to turn towards this world, right? He's totally taken out of the world in the sense, Rosenzweig. He is alive, but he looks as if he is dead, essentially. Yet Rosenzweig is still fighting with every fiber of his being to be turned towards the world, to be turned towards other human beings. Rosenzweig does not turn away from it. All right? Day by day, he places himself into his sufferings and brings us tidings of the imperishable life of the human person. This existence of his, the way it spoke to me, does it not bear witness to the life of man in this world? Does it not show us all how all of us placed into this world and attached to it endure our being sent away from it? Must not the world, the creation, be redeemed at some temporal point? After all, to be sure, we must submit to the extinction of the light before our eyes, to this human being growing mute. Has the world shown us again that God and man must give way to it? Has he really given way, or is he not really recreated by God at this moment, newly placed into this world? I am asking this exactly as I'm truly experiencing it. So I know there's a lot going on here, but I want to just capture the essence of it. What so profoundly captivates Trib is that in his encounter with Rosenzweig, he encounters somebody who, as I said, in the face of death, in the face of when everything is being taken away, right, still wants to be in this world. And when you see that kind of struggle in the face of the impossible, there's something about it that is singular, that is exceptional in only the way that human beings can, right? There's been countless stories of this in Israel here the last couple of weeks about what do people do? How do people act in the face of death? How do people act in ways that seem impossible, that look death in the face and say, not today? That's what Rosenzweig embodied in the rest of his life. And again, to be clear, it doesn't mean that if a person dies that they have somehow given in or that they are not fighting for life. Rosenzweig is going to die. He knows this. Trib knows this. Everybody knows this. But the question is, how do we respond to the time that we have? And to be human, right, means to recognize that we can stand apart from everything else in a way that is in some sense impossible. And there's that singularity of being human that allows us to stare death in the face and say that we still want to live, and should ultimately open us up to the possibility that there is things in this world that don't quite fit in, that don't quite make sense, that are impossible, but they somehow are still real, and that when we encounter them, they can become the grounds of our existence. And we'll continue to unpack that in the weeks to come. Next week, continuing more about human beings as being singular in the face of death. And then also, ultimately, what does it mean to encounter God, right, at the act of the image? So let me pause here, and I'm happy to, I know there was a question in the chat. I know we don't have a ton of time, but let me see if I can try to take it. Doesn't Rosenzweig present this maybe hidden will to stay as an existential necessity or an obligation as well? And though it might be a somewhat early stage to ask this question, would you call this a moral obligation according to Rosenzweig? So I think those are both good questions, and they do get at a lot of what's going on here. Is it an existential necessity? Well, the problem is that if it was a necessity, then people wouldn't necessarily be able to so easily say no to it. So I don't know if I would exactly use that language, but for Rosenzweig, it should be understood as an obligation, even to a certain extent as a compulsion, right? Part of what is going to become important for Rosenzweig is that if the human ability, or what makes humans human, what makes them in the image of God, what makes them singular, is their ability to say that, like, I am in the face of everything. Then what makes Jews Jews is that is something that we do as a collective, right? The Jews manifest this in a collective way, in a way that's often impossible. Our stubborn willingness to just still be here. What Rosenzweig reflects in his dying body, but in his will to live, right, was very much the Jewish condition for too much of our history, in the sense that it looks like we shouldn't still be here. Doesn't make sense that we are somehow still going at it. Yet if there's one obligation a Jew has, it is to be here today, in life, so and to get to tomorrow. So I do think for Jews, it becomes an obligation, and even to a certain extent, a moral obligation. I think at a certain level, Rosenzweig sees that as something all human beings in a certain sense strive for, but it is the condition of what it means to be chosen by God and in a covenantal relationship with God, right? And all that comes with that, which we'll unpack in the weeks to come, right? To be in a relationship with God is to recognize the way in which we are compelled to live, even when so much of the world is often trying to tell us that it would be so much easier not to, right? I mean, again, we look at the conflict right now, like it would be so much easier for the world if the Jews just weren't here. And what does it mean to continue in the face of that, in the face of the impossible, right? Is the ultimate challenge of being a Jew. But it no longer makes sense to be Jewish, that we're still here. That was the hinge point in Rosenzweig's life, is that realization. But it doesn't make sense somehow we still, keep going. And when we keep going, it doesn't, in a certain sense, it actually reveals who we truly are, right? Because when you are suddenly walking in the opposite direction of the rest of the world, it says something fundamental about who you are. And when you continue to embrace life in the face of death, again, it reveals more about who you are than when you're living your everyday life just like everybody else. So in a sense, like the question, much of the Star of Redemption, it begins with the encounter with death, and then people know that the last two words of the star into life, right? That the whole work of the Star of Redemption is to get you to a place where you can actually live. And as we know, when you look at the world right now, right, it seems like a lot more people want to die than they want to live, because it's not so easy to live. A lot of times it's easier to die. As Rosenzweig's point about philosophy, ideology, it'll give you all sorts of good reasons to die, right? The challenge is, what does it actually mean to live? It's hard to live. It's extraordinarily hard to live.
Rabbi Truboff, just to relay a quick question that was sent to me in the chat. Would it be possible for you to send the sources that we've studied today to the participants?
Yeah, I'll send them to Kayla, who can
To the office, okay.
Everybody. Just with the war going on here, I was not as prepared.
Oh, of course, yeah, no, it's just a question.
To get things to people. But
Completely.
again, this is, if I appreciate about Rosenzweig, this is where everything gets stripped away, right? And you just have to face like the most basic questions of life and death. It's not often we get to do that. In some sense, you could argue there's like a privilege in being able to do that, because most of modern life is about avoiding those issues. But sometimes you have no choice. And when you finally confront them, maybe that's when everything finally begins. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we finish?
I have something. So you noted the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. There's I'm going to say a rephrasing of that that is used called the Tomb of the Unknowns. So it seems like your characterization, obviously soldiers represent kind of like an individual within this context. And when they say it as the Tomb of the Unknowns, it seems to like abstract it out from the experience of the soldier to some sort of paradigm for society in a way that it magnifies it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, society is always trying to give us messages of how we are part of some greater collective that we are subsumed within. Look, it's very powerful, right? Like in moments like this right now in Israel, right? The sense that you are part of a nation, you are part of something greater, right? Is a very powerful thing. And there's something holy about it. And there's a whole way in which Rosenzweig conceives of that from a Jewish perspective. But what Rosenzweig also knows is that deep down, right? Like when you're staring at the rockets, like that's not enough. And that sensibility that it's not, the nation isn't enough, right? Is something we have to hold on to, right? Because it reflects something about the infinite value of the human life that we can never look away from.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you always to everyone who participates in classes and joined us today. Mishnah learning continues this fall with Mishnah in Depth, Masachet Yevamot with Rabbi David Silber. It starts this Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And as always, many more classes happening. You can register and learn more on our website at 5784.drisha.org/fall. And we will be together again next week for Rabbi Truboff's class.
I'll just add, this is probably the most abstract we'll be, which is probably not the best for the first class. We'll be more concrete if you felt like I was a little too in the sky. But again, this is where Rosenzweig begins. So we all kind of have to start here too.
Okay, looking forward to being together again next week. Stay safe, Rabbi Truboff, and we'll see you
Thank you.
next week. Lehitraot.